My dad had my boyfriend framed for embezzlement, doctored child porn charges, and set the arrest for 9 a.m., then told me I had one night to choose between his freedom or mine. When I confronted him, he smiled and said, "Did you really think I'd let you run off with someone I couldn't control?" I just stared at him. That was 2 years ago. Yesterday, he died in prison, and I didn't go to the funeral. When did your parents' interference ruin your life? I discovered my dad had been following me to work every day and getting my coworkers fired if he thought they were bad influences, which explained why nobody at my office lasted more than 3 months, and why I kept finding GPS trackers on my car. My dad had always been overprotective. When I was growing up, he ran background checks on my friends' parents and made me text him photos every hour to prove where I was. He'd show up at parties to check the exits and pull me out of sleepovers if he heard someone cough. Mom left him when I was 12 because she said living with him was like being under surveillance. I thought moving 3 hours away from my job would give me freedom, but distance just made him more obsessive. He'd call constantly asking about my commute route, what I ate for lunch, who sat near me at work. I gave vague answers and figured he was just being his usual paranoid self. Then my coworker mentioned seeing my dad at the coffee shop across from our office every morning. He must really love his morning coffee, she laughed. My blood went cold. That coffee shop had a perfect view of our building entrance. I confronted him that night and he didn't even deny it. He'd been driving 3 hours every morning to follow me to work, sitting there all day watching who I talked to. He showed me his notebooks, detailed logs of everyone I interacted with, their license plates, their threat levels. He'd been getting people fired by calling in anonymous complaints when they got too friendly with me. That Mark guy was clearly an alcoholic, he said, and Jen had debt problems. You can't be around unstable people. He explained his system proudly. He'd befriended security guards, janitors, anyone who could give him information. Anyone who failed his tests got reported to HR with manufactured evidence. My workplace had become his personal experiment in controlling my environment. Then I realized how many of my relationships he'd destroyed. People I'd thought ghosted me had actually been threatened. My college roommate didn't suddenly move away. Dad had called her parents with fake stories about me. The guy I dated briefly didn't lose interest. Dad had him arrested on planted substance charges that got dropped but cost him his job. Every connection I'd tried to make, he'd severed systematically. I tried to get him banned from my workplace, but he thought ahead. He volunteered for building security committees, donated to office charities, made himself indispensable. When I complained, people thought I was ungrateful for having such a devoted father. He'd even convinced my boss he was helping protect the company from bad hires. My boss thanked him for his vigilance while I stood there speechless. I tried to take my mind off his insanity by dating Ben from accounting. Dad couldn't get him fired because Ben's uncle owned the company. For the first time, I had someone Dad couldn't remove. Ben noticed things I'd normalized, like how my coworkers were terrified to talk to me, or how the janitor reported my conversations. When I finally told him everything, he helped me see how insane my life had become. We tried to document Dad's stalking, but he was always just within legal boundaries, sitting in public spaces, making concerned reports, volunteering for committees. The police said without threats or violence, he was just an over-involved parent. So Ben and I decided to move to his hometown, where his family had connections Dad couldn't infiltrate. We planned secretly, booking flights under his name, using only cash. The night before we were supposed to leave, I found Dad in my apartment with boxes of evidence. But this time it wasn't about me. He had photos of Ben with underage girls, bank records showing embezzled funds, messages planning to sell company secrets. All fabricated, but so professionally done they looked real. "Did you really think I'd let you run off with someone I couldn't control?" he asked. "I've been building this for months." He explained his new plan. He'd already filed reports with Ben's uncle about the embezzlement, sent anonymous tips about the photos to police. "The warrant will be issued tomorrow morning," he said calmly. "Ben can spend 20 years in prison, or you can stay here where you belong. Your choice." He showed me more evidence. Ben's fingerprints on doctored documents, security footage edited to show him stealing, a digital trail so perfect even experts would believe it. I tried to warn Ben, but Dad had already thought of that. "Go ahead, tell him," he said. "Tell him to run, make him look guilty, or let him get arrested at work tomorrow in front of everyone. Either way, his life is over unless you stay." He'd finally found the perfect leverage, someone I actually loved who he could destroy completely. My hands shook as I realized the trap. If I warned Ben, he'd run and look guilty. If I didn't, he'd be arrested for crimes that would ruin him. Dad had spent months creating evidence so seamless that no one would believe Ben's innocence. "I'll give you tonight to say goodbye," Dad said, heading for the door. "But if you're not at work tomorrow morning like nothing happened, Ben's arrest will be messy. Resisting arrest maybe. Police get trigger happy with dangerous criminals." I sat in my apartment knowing I had hours to choose. Condemn an innocent man to prison, or condemn myself to a lifetime of surveillance. I was screwed. I stared at the evidence spread across my coffee table, each fabricated document more damning than the last. The photos made my stomach turn. Dad had somehow created images that looked disturbingly real. Ben's face seamlessly edited onto situations that never happened. The bank records showed transfers I knew Ben never made, timestamps matching days we'd been together. My father had been planning this for months while I'd been foolishly thinking I'd found someone he couldn't touch. My phone buzzed. Ben texting about our morning flight, excited about our new life together. I couldn't bring myself to respond. How could I tell him that in 12 hours police would storm into his office with a warrant? That his uncle would see evidence of embezzlement so convincing even I might have believed it if I hadn't watched Dad lay it all out? I picked up one of the doctored photos, studying it. The lighting was perfect, the angles consistent. Dad must have hired professionals or learned these skills himself during his obsessive years of surveillance. This wasn't the work of an amateur. This was systematic, calculated destruction. The apartment felt smaller than ever. I paced between rooms, trying to think of options Dad hadn't already anticipated. Call the police? They'd already dismissed his stalking as parental concern. Warn Ben's uncle? Dad had probably already poisoned that well with preliminary concerns about Ben's behavior. Run anyway? Dad would follow through on his threats, and Ben would pay the price. I grabbed my laptop and started searching for any way to prove the evidence was fake. But Dad had been thorough. The metadata on the photos checked out. The bank records matched real account numbers. Even the security footage he'd altered had timestamps that aligned with Ben's actual schedule. He'd built his lies on a foundation of truth, making them nearly impossible to disprove. My hands trembled as I opened my banking app. Maybe I could buy us more time, get Ben somewhere safe while I figured this out. But my accounts showed unusual activity. Recent large withdrawals I hadn't made, transfers to suspicious accounts. Dad had been setting me up too, creating a paper trail that made it look like I was in on Ben's supposed crimes. I called my bank, but the customer service representative informed me that I'd already called earlier to authorize the transactions. Of course, Dad had thought of that too. He probably had recordings of my voice, spliced together to create conversations that never happened. The representative even mentioned I'd verified my security questions, which meant Dad knew details about my life I'd never told him. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in. Every escape route I considered, Dad had already blocked. He'd spent years studying me, learning my patterns, predicting my moves. This wasn't just surveillance anymore. This was psychological warfare, and he'd been preparing for this battle my entire life. I thought about calling Mom, but she'd cut contact completely after the divorce. She'd warned me about Dad's controlling nature, begged me to see the truth about him, but I'd been too young, too convinced that his protection came from love. Now I understood why she'd run so far, changed her name, disappeared completely. She'd known what he was capable of. My laptop dinged with a new email. Security footage from my building showing Ben entering at suspicious hours, carrying boxes that could contain anything in the grainy footage. More fabricated evidence, timestamps altered to create a pattern of suspicious behavior. Dad was still adding to his collection, making the case more airtight with each passing hour. I tried to think like Dad, to predict his next moves. He'd want me isolated, dependent, with no options but compliance. He'd probably already started spreading rumors at my workplace, planting seeds of doubt about Ben. By tomorrow, my coworkers would be primed to believe the worst when the arrest happened. The smart thing would be to warn Ben immediately, to hell with the consequences. But Dad's threat about resisting arrest echoed in my mind. He had connections everywhere, people who owed him favors or believed his lies. One word from him and Ben's arrest could turn violent. I couldn't risk Ben's life on the chance that Dad was bluffing. I pulled out my phone to text Ben, then stopped. Dad was probably monitoring my communications, had been for years. Every text, every call, every email likely passed through his surveillance network. There's something deeply unsettling about how methodical this father's surveillance has become. Notebooks with threat levels and detailed logs. I wonder what drives someone to spend 3 hours commuting just to watch their adult child's workplace all day. Because this level of dedication seems to go beyond typical overprotective behavior. That's how he'd known about our escape plan, how he'd prepared this trap so perfectly. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dad had spent so much time and energy protecting me from imaginary threats that he'd become the real danger in my life. Every person he'd driven away had been a potential lifeline, someone who might have helped me escape his control, but he'd systematically eliminated them all, leaving me with no one to turn to except Ben. And now he was taking Ben too. I opened my closet and pulled out an old photo album, one of the few things I'd kept from childhood. Pictures of birthday parties where Dad had run background checks on every guest, school events where he'd volunteered just to monitor my interactions, family vacations that were really just opportunities for him to control every aspect of my environment. The signs had always been there. My neighbor knocked on my door, startling me. Mrs. Allen from across the hall, holding a package. She handed it to me with a strange look, mentioning that a nice man had asked her to deliver it. My blood ran cold as I recognized Dad's handwriting on the label. Inside was a burner phone and a single photo. Ben at an ATM, taken from an angle that made it look like he was conducting a suspicious transaction. The timestamp showed tonight, just an hour ago. Dad was still out there, still watching, still gathering ammunition for his war against anyone who tried to help me. The burner phone rang. Dad's voice was calm, almost cheerful. He reminded me about tomorrow's deadline, mentioned that Ben's uncle had already received an anonymous tip about checking the company's books. The investigation would start with or without an arrest, but cooperation would make things easier for everyone. I hung up without responding. There had to be something I'd missed, some weakness in Dad's plan. He'd always been thorough, but nobody was perfect. I started going through the evidence again, looking for any sign of manipulation that could be proven, but each document was crafted with expertise that suggested years of preparation. The hours ticked by as I searched for solutions. I considered reaching out to old friends, but Dad had poisoned those relationships long ago. I thought about hiring a lawyer, but with what money? Dad had made sure I looked complicit in Ben's supposed crimes. Any lawyer would see me as part of the problem, not a victim needing help. I found myself at my window, staring out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Ben was probably packing for our trip, unaware that his life was about to implode. Dad was probably in his car, watching my building, making sure I didn't try to run. And I was trapped between them, forced to choose between my freedom and Ben's future. The burner phone buzzed with a text, GPS coordinates and a time, 6 a.m., 1 hour before Ben's arrest was scheduled. Dad wanted to meet, probably to gloat over his victory, or maybe to offer some twisted deal, another layer of control disguised as compromise. I deleted the message, but I knew I'd probably go. What other choice did I have? I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ben in handcuffs, his life destroyed because he'd tried to help me. I saw Dad's satisfied smile, knowing he'd won again. I saw my future stretching out ahead of me, an endless series of days under his surveillance, every relationship sabotaged before it could begin. As dawn approached, I made my decision. I couldn't let Ben pay for my father's sickness. I'd meet Dad, try to negotiate, maybe find some way to satisfy his need for control without destroying an innocent person. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than doing nothing. I got dressed mechanically, preparing for what felt like a funeral. In a way it was. The death of my hopes for a normal life, for relationships uncontaminated by Dad's interference. The death of my naive belief that I could simply walk away from his influence. The city was still dark as I left my apartment. Dad's coordinates led to a parking garage a few blocks from Ben's office. Of course he'd chosen somewhere with no cameras, no witnesses. He'd thought of everything, as always. My footsteps echoed in the empty structure as I climbed to the specified level. Dad was waiting by his car, looking pleased with himself. He'd brought coffee and pastries, as if this was a normal father-daughter breakfast. The casualness of it made my skin crawl. He could destroy lives and then act like nothing had happened, like this was all perfectly reasonable. He showed me his phone, the anonymous tip ready to send to the police. One button and Ben's arrest would be set in motion. But he was willing to delete everything, to let Ben leave town unharmed, if I agreed to his terms. The terms were simple. I'd quit my job, move back to my hometown, live under his direct supervision. No more attempts to escape, no more relationships he didn't approve of. I stared at the phone in his hand, at the power he wielded so casually. This was my life now, negotiating with my own father for scraps of freedom. But what choice did I have? Ben didn't deserve to suffer for my family's dysfunction. I opened my mouth to agree, to surrender to Dad's control once and for all. But then I noticed something. A small detail in one of the photos on his phone, something he'd missed in all his careful planning. My heart raced as I realized Dad had finally made a mistake, one that might give me the leverage I needed. But I had to be careful. If he realized what I'd seen, he'd correct it before I could use it against him. I kept my face neutral, pretending to consider his offer while my mind raced through possibilities. For the first time in years, I had a chance to fight back. The question was whether I was brave enough to take it. I kept my expression carefully blank as I studied the photo on Dad's phone screen. In the reflection of a storefront window behind the fabricated scene, I could make out a billboard billboard advertisement. The problem was, that billboard had been taken down 6 months ago for renovations. I remembered because Ben and I had joked about the construction noise during our lunch breaks. Dad had somehow used an old photo as his background, not realizing the timestamp would be impossible. My mind raced through the implications. This single error could unravel everything, but only if I played it perfectly. Dad was watching me intently, waiting for my surrender. I forced myself to slump in defeat, letting him see what he expected to see. I nodded slowly, as if accepting his terms. His satisfaction was palpable as he began outlining his expectations for my return home. While he spoke, I mentally cataloged every piece of fabricated evidence I'd seen. If he'd made one mistake, there might be others. The drive back to my apartment gave me time to think. Dad followed me, of course, his headlights a constant reminder in my rearview mirror. But for the first time in years, his presence didn't fill me with helpless dread. I had a thread to pull, and I was going to unravel his web completely. Back in my apartment, I began my own investigation. Dad would expect me to pack, to prepare for my surrender. Instead, I opened my laptop and started researching. The billboard company's website showed their renovation schedule. The advertisement in Dad's photo had been removed on March 15th, but the fabricated photo was supposedly taken in July. I dug deeper, cross-referencing every piece of evidence I could remember. The bank statements he'd shown me used a font that the bank had changed 2 years ago. The security footage had shadows that didn't match the timestamps. Dad had been meticulous, but he'd been working alone, and even he couldn't catch every detail. My phone rang constantly, Dad checking in, making sure I was packing, reminding me of tomorrow's deadline. I gave him what he wanted to hear while documenting everything I found, but I needed more than just inconsistencies. I needed to understand his methods, his tools, his vulnerabilities. I thought about his network of informants, the security guards, janitors, all the people he'd cultivated over the years. They believed they were helping a concerned father. What if I could turn that belief against him? The next morning, I arrived at work early. Dad was already at his usual spot in the coffee shop watching. I waved at him through the window, playing the part of the defeated daughter. Then I went to find Min, the head of building security. Min had always been kind to me, even as she'd reported my activities to Dad. I found her in the security office, reviewing the previous night's footage. When I asked to speak with her privately, she looked uncomfortable but agreed. I laid out everything: Dad's surveillance, the fabricated evidence against Ben, the years of manipulation. Min's face went through a series of expressions as I spoke: disbelief, then recognition, then horror, as she realized how she'd been used. She pulled up her communication logs with Dad, hundreds of messages over the years, each one seeming reasonable in isolation, but together, they painted a picture of obsession that made her sick. She showed me something I hadn't expected. Dad had been asking about other employees too, gathering information on everyone, not just those close to me. Min made copies of everything. She also revealed that Dad had given her access to a cloud storage account where he kept his security research. My hands shook as she helped me log in. Thousands of files, photos, documents, all meticulously organized. And in his arrogance, Dad had included his working files, showing how he'd created the false evidence. I found the Photoshop projects, the audio editing software, the document templates. He'd taught himself these skills over years, turning his retirement into a full-time job of controlling my life. But he'd also left a trail of his methods, thinking his password-protected account was secure. Plot twist worthy of a tech thriller. Dad's digital puppetry comes with receipts. Nothing says I love you quite like thousands of surveillance files and a Photoshop folder labeled "Destroying My Daughter's Relationships." Ben arrived at work, and I intercepted him before he could reach his office. His uncle was already there, going through files based on Dad's anonymous tip. I pulled Ben into an empty conference room and showed him everything I'd found. His face went pale as he realized how close he'd come to destruction, but then his expression hardened with determination. Together, we began building our counter case. Every piece of false evidence had a digital fingerprint, a creation date, an editing history that Dad hadn't thought to hide. We worked through the morning, knowing that Dad was watching from his coffee shop perch, probably wondering why I wasn't packing. Let him wonder. I was done being predictable. Ben's uncle, Jonathan, was initially skeptical when we approached him. The evidence against Ben looked damning at first glance, but as we walked him through the inconsistencies, showed him the original files and the editing history, his skepticism turned to rage. Jonathan had built his company on trust and integrity. The thought that someone had tried to manipulate him into destroying his own nephew infuriated him. He immediately called his lawyer and his head of IT security. Within hours, we had a team of experts examining Dad's fabrications. The IT specialist, Nathan, was particularly helpful. He explained how metadata could be manipulated, but never perfectly hidden. Every edit left traces, and Dad's self-taught skills, while impressive, weren't professional enough to fool real experts. As the day progressed, our case grew stronger, but I knew Dad wouldn't sit idle. Sure enough, my phone rang with a blocked number. Dad had noticed I wasn't packing. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the edge of panic. I told him I needed another day, that I was saying goodbye to coworkers. He didn't believe me, but what could he do? Storm into the building? He'd spent years cultivating his image as the helpful, concerned father. One wrong move would shatter that facade. That evening, I met with more of Dad's unwitting accomplices. The janitor who'd reported my conversations, the cafe owner who'd given Dad information about my lunch companions. Each one reacted with shock and shame when they realized how they'd been manipulated. The cafe owner, Victoria, was particularly upset. She'd thought she was helping protect me from bad influences. When I showed her how Dad had used her information to destroy innocent people's careers, she broke down. She gave me records of all their conversations, adding to my growing pile of evidence. But I needed more than just evidence of his methods. I needed to understand his psychology, his triggers, his fears. I called Mom for the first time in years, using a burner phone I'd bought with cash. Her voice was cautious when she answered. She'd changed her name, moved across the country, built a new life, but she still feared Dad finding her. When I told her what was happening, she was silent for a long moment. Then she began to talk. She told me about the early years, how Dad's protection had seemed loving at first, how it had gradually escalated until she couldn't breathe without his permission. She'd tried to take me when she left, but Dad had threatened to use his connections to paint her as an unfit mother. The conversation revealed Dad's deepest fear: abandonment. His own mother had left when he was young, and he'd never recovered. His need to control came from terror of being left behind again. Mom had triggered that fear by leaving, and now I was doing the same. She also told me about his patterns. When cornered, Dad would escalate dramatically. He'd rather destroy everything than lose control. I needed to be ready for whatever desperate move he might make. The next morning arrived too quickly. Ben's arrest was scheduled for 9 a.m. if I didn't comply. I arrived at work early again, but this time with a plan. Jonathan had arranged for his lawyer to be present, along with a private investigator who specialized in digital forensics. At 8:45, my phone rang. Dad, checking if I was ready to leave with him. I told him I was in the parking garage, ready to go. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was in the garage, but not to leave. I was there with Jonathan's security team, documenting Dad's arrival. He pulled up in his car, looking triumphant. The moment he stepped out, I could see he'd already started planning my new life under his control. He had boxes in his backseat, probably full of surveillance equipment for my new home. I approached him slowly, letting him think he'd won. He started talking about the house he'd prepared, the job he'd arranged for me at a local library where he knew all the staff. Every word revealed how long he'd been planning this moment. At exactly 9 a.m., he pulled out his phone to check if Ben had been arrested. His face changed when he saw no news alerts, no calls from his contacts. He looked at me, and I let him see the truth in my expression. Before he could react, Jonathan emerged from behind a pillar, along with his lawyer and the investigator. Dad's face cycled through emotions as Jonathan explained that they'd examined all the evidence against Ben and found it fabricated. Dad tried to leave, but I stepped forward. I told him about the billboard, about the metadata, about every mistake he'd made. His face went white as he realized his perfect plan had unraveled, but he wasn't finished. His hand went to his pocket, and for a moment, I thought he might have a weapon. Instead, he pulled out another phone, his backup plan. He had more evidence, he said. Worse things that would destroy not just Ben, but me too. I felt the familiar fear creeping back. How many contingencies had he prepared? How deep did his planning go? But then I noticed something. His hands were shaking. For the first time in my life, I saw Dad afraid. The investigator asked to see this new evidence. Dad hesitated, and in that moment, I knew he was bluffing. He'd put everything into his first attack, never believing I could counter it. He had no backup plan because he'd never imagined losing control. Jonathan's lawyer outlined Dad's options. They could involve the police, press charges for fraud, harassment, and attempted destruction of evidence. Or Dad could accept a restraining order and cease all contact with me and anyone in my life. Dad's face contorted with rage. He turned to me, and for a moment, I saw not my father, but a stranger consumed by his own obsession. He started to speak, to threaten, to bargain, but I turned away. I was done listening to him. The security team escorted him from the building. As his car disappeared from view, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. But I knew this wasn't over. Dad wouldn't give up so easily. Over the next days, I discovered the full extent of his interference in my life. Former friends came forward with stories of threats and manipulation. Ex-boyfriends revealed the pressure they'd faced to leave me. Each story added to the legal case building against Dad. Ben and I postponed our move, not out of fear, but out of determination. We wouldn't run from Dad anymore. Instead, we worked with lawyers to ensure he could never hurt us again. The restraining order was just the beginning. I also began reaching out to the people Dad had driven away. Some relationships were too damaged to repair, but others welcomed the chance to reconnect. My college roommate, Joni, had always wondered why I'd suddenly cut contact. When she learned the truth, she flew in to support me. The legal proceedings moved slowly but steadily. Dad tried various tactics to regain control. He sent letters through third parties, had distant relatives call with guilt trips, even hired a private investigator to follow me. Each violation of the restraining order added to the case against him. But the most disturbing discovery came from Min's continued investigation. She found evidence that Dad had been building files on other young women in the building, particularly those who reminded him of me. His obsession was evolving, looking for new targets to control. This revelation changed everything. It wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. Jonathan immediately increased security measures and worked with building management to ban Dad permanently. They also notified other businesses in the area. I started therapy to process years of manipulation and control. The therapist helped me recognize patterns I'd internalized, ways I'd limited myself to avoid triggering Dad's interference. Healing would take time, but each session made me stronger. Ben stood by me through everything. Our relationship, forged in crisis, proved resilient. We learned to trust each other completely, to communicate openly about fears and boundaries. Dad had tried to use Ben against me, but instead had created an unbreakable bond between us. Months passed. The legal case grew stronger as more evidence emerged. Dad's carefully constructed image crumbled as word spread about his actions. The community that had once seen him as a devoted father now recognized him as dangerous. I learned he'd lost his volunteer positions, been banned from multiple establishments, and faced social isolation. Part of me felt guilty, but my therapist reminded me that these were consequences of his own actions, not my responsibility. One day, Min showed me something unexpected. Dad had tried to access his cloud storage, not knowing we'd changed all the passwords, but in his attempt, he'd revealed his location. He was living in a small apartment 2 towns over, still close enough to violate the restraining order. This information went straight to the lawyers. The judge, reviewing the continued violations and the evidence of potential new targets, issued a stronger order. Dad would face jail time if he came within 5 miles of me or attempted any contact. The threat of imprisonment finally seemed to penetrate Dad's obsession. The attempts at contact stopped. The private investigator he'd hired reported that Dad had called off the surveillance. How did Nathan figure out exactly which software Dad used to change those files? The way metadata leaves tiny clues behind reminds me of how footprints show in mud, even when someone tries to cover them up. For the first time in my life, I experienced true privacy, but I remained vigilant. I'd learned that freedom required active protection. I installed security systems, varied my routines, and maintained strong connections with people who could help if Dad resurfaced. Ben and I finally took our delayed trip, not as an escape, but as a celebration. We visited his hometown, met his extended family, and began planning a future free from Dad's shadow. The trip showed me what normal family relationships could look like. When we returned, I found a letter waiting, not from Dad, but from Mom. She'd been following the legal proceedings from afar, proud of my courage in standing up to him. She wanted to reconnect, to rebuild our relationship on new terms. Meeting Mom after so many years was emotional. She looked older, but also lighter, free from the constant fear that had defined her life with Dad. We talked for hours, filling in the gaps of lost years and discovering how similar our experiences had been. She shared more insights into Dad's psychology, helping me understand the roots of his behavior without excusing it. His mother's abandonment had created a wound that festered into obsession. He'd rather cage the people he claimed to love than risk losing them. This understanding didn't create sympathy, but it did bring closure. Dad wasn't a monster. He was a deeply damaged person who'd chosen to damage others rather than heal himself. I could pity him while still protecting myself from him. The final legal hearing arrived 6 months after that morning in the parking garage. Dad appeared, looking diminished. The confident controller was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the consequences of his actions. The judge reviewed all the evidence: years of stalking, fabricated documents, attempted destruction of careers and relationships. The list of Dad's violations filled pages. The judgment was comprehensive: permanent restraining orders, mandatory psychiatric treatment, and supervised probation. probation. If Dad violated any terms, he'd face immediate imprisonment. The judge made it clear that this was his last chance. Any attempt to contact me or interfere in my life would result in years behind bars. Dad's lawyer tried to argue for leniency, painting him as a loving father who'd gone too far, but the judge saw through it. Love doesn't manifest as control. Protection doesn't require destruction of autonomy. Dad's actions were about possession, not affection. As the hearing ended, Dad looked at me one last time. I saw a flicker of the father I'd once believed in, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and checked for monsters under my bed. But that man had been consumed by his own fears long ago. I left the courthouse feeling neither triumph nor sadness, just relief. The chapter of my life dominated by Dad's control was finally closing. Whatever happened to him now was his choice, his consequence, his path to walk alone. Ben and I moved forward with our plans. Not the desperate escape we'd originally attempted, but a thoughtful relocation to a place we'd chosen together. His hometown welcomed us, and I began building a life defined by my own choices. I found work at a company that valued my skills without knowing my history. I made friends who liked me for who I was, not who Dad allowed me to be. Every normal interaction felt like a small miracle after years of surveillance and sabotage. The therapy continued, helping me recognize and change patterns formed by years of control. I learned to trust my own judgment, to form relationships without waiting for them to be destroyed, to live without constantly looking over my shoulder. Mom became part of my life again, slowly and carefully. We built new memories to overlay the old trauma. She met Ben, approved of him genuinely rather than under duress. Family dinners became possible again, filled with laughter instead of tension. I also connected with others who'd escaped controlling relationships. Their stories echoed mine in different keys. We formed a support group, sharing strategies for healing and maintaining boundaries. Dad had isolated me, but I'd found a community of survivors. 1 year after the final hearing, I received news through my lawyer. Dad had been arrested for violating his restraining order against someone else. He'd found a new target, a young woman who reminded him of me, and begun his patterns again. This time, his actions were recognized immediately. The woman's employer, aware of Dad's history, contacted authorities at the first sign of suspicious behavior. Dad's probation was revoked, and he faced the imprisonment he'd been warned about. I felt no satisfaction at this news, only sadness that he'd chosen obsession over healing. The psychiatric treatment had been his chance to address his issues, but he'd seen it as punishment rather than opportunity. With Dad imprisoned, the last shadows of fear dissipated. I no longer checked for familiar cars in parking lots or tensed when unknown numbers called. The hypervigilance that had protected me for years finally relaxed. Ben and I got engaged on a quiet beach, just the two of us making promises without an audience. The wedding planning began without the dread of Dad's interference. We could invite whoever we wanted, celebrate however we chose. The wedding itself was small but joyful. Mom walked me down the aisle, both of us crying for different reasons than traditional weddings evoke. We'd both escaped, both survived, both found freedom on the other side of control. Jonathan gave a speech about resilience and truth prevailing over deception. Min and the others who'd helped expose Dad's manipulations attended as honored guests. Even Joni flew in, our friendship renewed and strengthened by honesty. As Ben and I exchanged vows, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. Dad had tried to use Ben to control me, but his plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of destroying our relationship, he'd forged it in fire. The reception was everything Dad would have hated, spontaneous, unmonitored, full of people he couldn't control. I danced with friends he'd driven away, laughed at stories he'd never hear, celebrated a future he'd have no part in. Later, as the evening wound down, Mom pulled me aside. She told me she was proud, not just of standing up to Dad, but of choosing healing over bitterness. We'd both been victims of his control, but we'd refused to let it define us forever. The honeymoon was the trip Ben and I had originally planned, finally taken without fear or urgency. We explored new places with the freedom to change plans, make mistakes, and discover things together. Every spontaneous decision felt like a small rebellion against years of surveillance. When we returned, life settled into a new normal. Work, friends, family dinners, weekend trips, all the ordinary things that had been impossible under Dad's control. The mundane became precious because I'd chosen it myself. I continued therapy, now focused on building healthy patterns rather than just breaking destructive ones. The therapist helped me recognize that healing wasn't a destination but a journey. Some days were harder than others, but the trajectory was consistently upward. 2 years after Dad's imprisonment, I received a letter forwarded through my lawyer. Dad had written from prison, not to apologize or manipulate, but to inform me he was terminally ill. The stress of imprisonment had accelerated health issues he'd ignored while focused on controlling others. I felt nothing at first, then a complex mix of emotions. Not forgiveness or reconciliation, but a kind of distant sorrow for the waste of it all. He'd spent his life building elaborate prisons for others and ended up in a literal one himself. I chose not to respond or visit. Some bridges, once burned, shouldn't be rebuilt. Dad had made his choices, and I'd made mine. My life was full of people who loved me without trying to control me. That was enough. The news of his illness spread through our old community. Some expected me to feel guilty or rush to reconcile, but those who truly understood supported my decision to maintain boundaries. Dying didn't erase years of manipulation and harm. Ben and I started a family of our own, determined to break the cycle of control. We read parenting books that emphasized trust and autonomy. Every decision was filtered through the question, are we protecting or controlling? When our daughter was born, I held her and promised she'd never know the suffocating weight of obsessive protection. She'd be safe but also free. She'd make mistakes and learn from them. She'd choose her own friends, her own path, her own life. Mom became a wonderful grandmother, bringing joy without baggage. She respected our parenting choices, offered advice only when asked, and showed what healthy family support looked like. 3 generations healing together. The support group I joined evolved into an advocacy organization. We worked with employers to recognize signs of stalking and harassment. We pushed for better legal protections for victims of family abuse. Dad's legacy, twisted into something positive. Word came that Dad had died alone in prison. I felt the same distant sorrow, nothing more. He'd been given chances to change, to heal, to build rather than control. He'd chosen his path to the end. There was no funeral to attend, no estate to settle. Dad had spent everything on his obsession, leaving nothing but cautionary tales and legal precedents. His notebooks and surveillance equipment became evidence in other cases, helping protect other victims. I marked his passing quietly, not with mourning, but with reflection on how far I'd come. The scared woman in that parking garage, discovering the depths of her father's manipulation, had transformed into someone strong and free. Life continued, rich with chosen relationships and self-determined goals. I advanced in my career without Dad's interference. Nathan's mom suddenly showing up with perfect timing after years of silence makes me wonder what she was really doing all that time. She claims she was following the legal stuff from far away, but something feels off about her waiting until Dad was completely out of the picture to reach out. I deepened friendships without fear of sabotage. I raised my daughter to be confident and independent. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I'd remember the father Dad could have been, the one who'd existed briefly before fear consumed him. But those memories no longer held power over me. They were just echoes of a different life. The real victory wasn't in Dad's imprisonment or death. It was in every normal day I lived on my own terms. Every decision I made without seeking permission. Every relationship I built without fear of destruction. Ben and I grew together, our marriage strengthened by the trials we'd overcome. We learned to recognize control patterns in ourselves and each other, addressing them before they could take root. Dad's negative example became our guide for what not to do. My daughter grew surrounded by love without conditions, protection without suffocation. She brought friends home without background checks. She went to sleepovers without hourly photo requirements. She lived the childhood I'd been denied. The company Ben's uncle owned thrived, with new security measures preventing future manipulation. Jonathan became a mentor, showing me how healthy professional relationships work. Success earned through merit, not surveillance and sabotage. Years passed. The acute trauma faded into processed experience. I could tell my story without reliving it, share my experience to help others without drowning in memories. Healing had transformed poison into medicine. I wrote about my experience, anonymously at first, then openly. The response overwhelmed me. So many people had similar stories, had lived under the control of someone who claimed to love them. My story gave them hope that escape was possible. Speaking engagements followed, sharing strategies for recognizing and escaping controlling relationships. I met survivors at every stage of their journey, some still trapped, some newly free, some years into healing. Each story reinforced that Dad's behavior wasn't unique, just extreme. The advocacy organization grew, pushing for legislative changes. We worked to close loopholes that allowed stalkers to operate within legal boundaries. Dad had exploited those gaps expertly. Future victims deserved better protection. My daughter reached the age I'd been when Mom left Dad. She was confident, independent, surrounded by friends we'd never investigated. She made choices I might not have made, and that was perfectly fine. Her autonomy was the point. One day, she asked about her grandfather. I told her the truth in age-appropriate terms. He'd been sick in a way that made him hurt people he claimed to love. He'd chosen control over connection, fear over faith. We'd protected her by staying away. She understood, in the way children do, that love shouldn't hurt or control. She'd grown up seeing healthy relationships, boundaries respected, autonomy celebrated. Dad's sickness hadn't infected another generation. Mom aged gracefully, finally free from the hypervigilance that had defined her middle years. We took trips together, made up for lost time. She shared stories of her own healing journey, the years spent rebuilding after escape. The legal precedents from Dad's case helped other victims. Judges recognized surveillance and manipulation as serious abuse. Restraining orders became easier to obtain and enforce. Dad's obsession had inadvertently strengthened protections for others. I sometimes wondered what Dad's final years were like. Did he ever recognize the harm he'd caused? Did he understand that his fears of abandonment had created exactly what he'd tried to prevent? Or did he die still believing he was the victim? It didn't matter. His internal reality had no bearing on my life anymore. I'd broken free from the narrative he'd tried to write for me. My story was my own, written in choices he'd never allowed and relationships he'd never controlled. The support group celebrated its 10th anniversary. Hundreds of members had found freedom, built new lives, broken cycles of control. We'd transformed individual trauma into collective strength. Dad would have hated everything we represented. Ben and I renewed our vows on that anniversary, surrounded by the community we'd built. The ceremony was everything our wedding had been and more. Spontaneous joy, chosen family, freedom celebrated. No shadows of control, just light. My daughter gave a speech about growing up in a home where love meant support, not surveillance, where protection meant teaching good judgment, not preventing all risks. She thanked us for breaking the cycle, for giving her wings instead of cages. As the evening ended, I stood surrounded by people Dad had tried to drive away or never allowed close. Each relationship was a small victory, proof that his control had ultimately failed. Love had won, just not the twisted version he'd offered. The girl who'd once texted hourly photos to prove her location had become a woman who chose her own path. The employee whose coworkers feared association had become a leader who fostered connection. The daughter trapped by false protection had become a mother who offered real safety. Dad's story ended in a prison of his own making. Mine continued in freedom I'd fought to claim. Every day brought new choices, new connections, new possibilities he'd never imagined I deserved. That was the ultimate triumph. Not revenge or vindication, but simply living well, building the life he'd tried to prevent, surrounding myself with the people he'd tried to remove, becoming the person he'd never allowed me to be. The scared woman in that parking garage had been right about one thing. I'd been screwed, but not in the way I'd thought. I'd been screwed out of years of normal life, healthy relationships, personal autonomy. Dad had stolen time I couldn't get back, but I'd refused to let him steal my future too. Every free choice, every genuine connection, every moment of peace was reclaimed territory. He'd controlled my past, but I owned my present and future completely. That morning when I'd noticed the billboard error had changed everything. One small mistake in his perfect plan had unraveled years of control. Sometimes freedom came from grand gestures, sometimes from tiny details. Mine had come from both. As I tucked my daughter into bed that night, she asked if I ever missed my dad. I considered the question honestly. I missed the father he could have been, the one glimpsed in rare moments before fear consumed him. But I didn't miss the reality of him. She hugged me and said she was glad I'd been brave. I hugged her back, grateful she'd never need the kind of bravery I'd had to find. Her courage could be spent on adventures, not escape. Her strength could build, not just survive. The next morning brought new challenges, new joys, new choices made freely. Dad's ghost held no power here. This was my life, lived on my terms, surrounded by people who loved without controlling. It was everything he'd feared, and exactly what I deserved. Freedom felt like breathing easily, choosing spontaneously, trusting completely. It felt like my daughter's laughter, Ben's support, Mom's healing, friends' loyalty. It felt like the life Dad had tried to prevent and failed to destroy. I'd won not by destroying him, but by building beyond him. His imprisonment was just consequence. My freedom was the real victory. Every normal, chosen, joyful day proved that control couldn't triumph over genuine connection. The woman in the parking garage had found her leverage and used it. But more importantly, she'd found herself beneath years of manipulation. That discovery, more than any legal victory, had set her truly free. The parking garage fell silent after Dad's threats. I watched his hands tremble as he clutched his backup phone, knowing knowing he was bluffing but unable to predict his next move. Jonathan's security team maintained their positions while the investigator documented everything on video. Dad's eyes darted between us, calculating. He pocketed the phone and turned toward his car, but I recognized the set of his shoulders. He wasn't retreating, he was regrouping. Years of living under his control had taught me to read his body language like a survival manual. Jonathan's lawyer moved to block Dad's path, outlining the legal consequences of his actions. Dad listened with the same expression he'd worn when planning my childhood schedules, as if this was just another problem to solve through meticulous control. The lawyer presented two options: accept a comprehensive restraining order or face criminal charges for fraud, harassment, and attempted destruction of evidence. I studied Dad's reaction, watching him process this unexpected reversal. His fingers tapped against his leg in the pattern he used when strategizing. He was already planning his countermove, probably calculating which of his remaining contacts he could activate, which pressure points he could still exploit. The security footage from Dad's cloud storage had revealed more than just his methods. It showed a network of unwitting accomplices across multiple locations: the DMV clerk who'd provided my license plate updates, the postal worker who'd reported my mail, the gym employee who'd shared my workout schedule. Each person thought they were helping a concerned father. None realized they were enabling systematic stalking. Ben stood beside me, his presence steady despite everything Dad had tried to do to him. His uncle's expression had shifted from skepticism to protective fury as the evidence mounted. Jonathan had built his company through trust and hard work. The attempted manipulation of his family business had transformed him from neutral observer to active ally. Dad finally spoke to the lawyer, negotiating terms as if this was a business transaction. He wanted guarantees, exceptions, loopholes he could exploit later. The lawyer remained firm: complete cessation of all surveillance, no contact with me or anyone in my life, no proximity to my home or workplace. Dad's treating legal consequences like a business deal he can negotiate his way out of. Someone should tell him stalking doesn't come with a customer satisfaction guarantee or return policy. Any violation would trigger immediate arrest. I noticed Dad's phone buzzing repeatedly in his pocket. His network was probably wondering why their morning reports hadn't been acknowledged, why their careful observations of my activities hadn't received the usual grateful responses. His system was already beginning to fracture without his constant maintenance. The private investigator pulled me aside, showing me something on his tablet. He'd traced the digital footprints of Dad's fabricated evidence and found something disturbing. Dad had been practicing these techniques on other targets, creating fake social media profiles and testing his document manipulation skills. The practice files dated back years, showing a level of premeditation that made my skin crawl. Jonathan made several phone calls while we waited for Dad's decision. Within minutes, building security throughout the business district had been alerted. Dad's photo would be circulated with warnings about his methods. The network he'd spent years building would be systematically dismantled by people who now understood how they'd been used. Dad's capitulation came not with words but with the slow placement of his car keys on the ground. The gesture meant he understood the parking garage was now off limits, that his daily surveillance routine was over. But I knew him too well to believe this was surrender. This was tactical retreat. Min arrived with additional security personnel, having spent the morning alerting Dad's other informants. The janitor who'd reported my conversations now understood why I'd seemed so isolated. The coffee shop owner who'd given Dad information about my lunch companions realized how she'd contributed to my imprisonment. Each revelation created another crack in Dad's carefully constructed system. The lawyer presented the restraining order documents. Dad read every line with the same intensity he'd once applied to my report cards, looking for weaknesses to exploit. His pen hesitated over the signature line, and I saw him glance at me with an expression I'd never seen before: uncertainty. Nathan, the IT specialist, had continued analyzing Dad's digital trail. He showed Jonathan evidence that Dad had been monitoring not just me, but several other young women in the building. The surveillance patterns were identical: detailed logs, threat assessments, systematic isolation of targets. My situation wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern. This revelation changed the legal landscape entirely. Jonathan immediately contacted building management and law enforcement. What had started as a family dispute now had broader implications. Dad wasn't just an overprotective father. He was a predator who used parental concern as camouflage. Dad signed the restraining order, but his signature was sharp, angry. He understood that his methods had been exposed, his network dismantled, his image shattered. The helpful father persona he'd cultivated for years had evaporated in a single morning. As security escorted Dad from the garage, I felt the weight of years lifting from my shoulders, but the feeling was tempered by knowledge of his patterns. He'd retreat, regroup, and return with new tactics. The restraining order was just paper, unless I remained vigilant. Ben and I returned to the office, where news of the morning's events had already spread. Co-workers who'd kept their distance, fearing Dad's retaliation, began approaching me with stories. The marketing manager revealed how Dad had questioned her about my projects. The receptionist admitted she'd been providing him with my daily schedule. Each confession added to my understanding of how thoroughly he'd infiltrated my life. Victoria from the cafe found me during lunch, carrying records of every conversation she'd had with Dad. The stack of printouts showed years of manipulation disguised as casual chat. She'd thought she was making small talk with a regular customer, not realizing she was providing intelligence for a stalking operation. The afternoon brought a stream of revelations. Former co-workers reached out through social media, explaining why they'd really left. Dad's anonymous complaints had been more extensive than I'd known. He'd destroyed careers, relationships, and reputations with surgical precision, all while maintaining his image as a protective father. Joni called from across the country, having heard through mutual friends about Dad's exposure. She revealed the full extent of his threats against her during college. He'd contacted her parents, her employer, even her landlord, spreading carefully crafted lies designed to make her seem dangerous. She'd moved away not by choice, but from fear. The legal team worked through the evening, building a comprehensive case. Each piece of evidence revealed new layers of Dad's obsession. He'd spent more money on surveillance than most people spent on their mortgages. He'd dedicated his entire retirement to controlling my life. Ben's uncle implemented new security protocols throughout the company. Background checks would now include screening for stalking behaviors. The HR department would be trained to recognize manipulation tactics. Dad's actions had inadvertently led to stronger protections for all employees. I spent hours with the investigator, providing context for Dad's files. Each document told a story of escalating control. The evolution from protective parent to systematic stalker was documented in his own meticulous records. He'd created the evidence of his own obsession. That night, I stayed with Ben at his apartment, knowing Dad would likely violate the restraining order immediately. Sure enough, security cameras caught him driving past my building multiple times. Each violation was documented, building the case for his his eventual arrest. Mom called after midnight, having heard about the confrontation through family channels. Her voice carried years of vindication mixed with sorrow. She shared more details about Dad's behavior during their marriage, patterns I now recognized in my own experience. We'd both been prisoners. She'd just escaped earlier. The next days blurred together in a mixture of legal procedures and personal revelations. Dad's violations of the restraining order escalated quickly. He hired private investigators to follow me. He sent messages through distant relatives. He even attempted to access my medical records through a contact at a clinic. Each violation strengthened the legal case against him. The judge who reviewed the evidence expressed shock at the extent of Dad's surveillance network. The restraining order was strengthened, with explicit warnings about imprisonment for any further violations. But Dad couldn't stop. His need for control overrode self-preservation. Within a week, he was caught attempting to install cameras near my apartment. The arrest was swift and decisive. The image of him in handcuffs should have brought satisfaction, but I felt only exhaustion. The bail hearing revealed more disturbing information. Police had searched Dad's apartment and found detailed files on multiple women. His obsession had metastasized beyond just me. The judge denied bail, citing public safety concerns. I began therapy to process the years of manipulation. The therapist specialized in stalking victims and recognized patterns I'd internalized. We worked on identifying the ways Dad's control had shaped my behavior, the automatic responses I'd developed for survival. Ben remained steadfast through the emotional turbulence. Our relationship, tested by Dad's attempts to destroy it, emerged stronger. We learned to communicate openly about triggers and boundaries. Trust, once shattered by Dad's manipulations, slowly rebuilt through consistent support. The criminal trial moved forward with mounting evidence. Dad's own records became the prosecution's strongest weapons. He'd documented his crimes in exhaustive detail, never imagining his files would be used against him. His need to control had created a perfect record of his stalking. Former victims came forward as news of the case spread. Women who'd worked in my building, lived in my neighborhood, or simply resembled me enough to catch Dad's attention. Each story added weight to the charges against him. Dad's defense attorney tried to paint him as a loving father whose protective instincts had gone too far, but the evidence told a different story. This wasn't protection, it was possession. The jury saw through the facade to the calculating predator beneath. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation. Guilty on all counts: stalking, harassment, fraud, attempted destruction of evidence. The list of convictions reflected years of systematic abuse disguised as parental concern. Sentencing brought a mix of emotions. The judge imposed the maximum penalty, citing the premeditated nature of Dad's actions and the multiple victims. Dad would spend years in prison, finally contained by walls he couldn't manipulate. I sat in the courtroom as they led him away, searching for any sign of recognition or remorse. But Dad's expression remained defiant. Even facing imprisonment, he couldn't acknowledge the harm he'd caused. In his mind, he was still the victim of ungrateful children who didn't appreciate his protection. The months following Dad's imprisonment brought unexpected challenges. Freedom, so long desired, felt foreign. I found myself checking for surveillance that no longer existed, limiting my movements from habit rather than necessity. Therapy intensified as we worked on reclaiming autonomy. Simple decisions felt overwhelming after years of having choices made for me. I had to relearn how to trust my own judgment, how to form relationships without expecting them to be sabotaged. Ben and I moved forward with our delayed plans, but thoughtfully rather than desperately. We chose a new city together, far from Dad's former network, but not in panicked flight. The move felt like choice rather than escape. The way Dad's whole network just fell apart like dominoes is really interesting. I wonder if those informants felt tricked or maybe relieved when they found out what they'd actually been part of. Mom and I rebuilt our relationship slowly. We met in neutral locations at first, both carrying the hypervigilance that Dad had instilled. Gradually, we learned to relax in each other's presence, to have conversations not dominated by fear of his interference. I found work in my field without Dad's shadow looming over every interaction. Coworkers became friends naturally, without the fear of his retaliation. Professional success felt earned rather than permitted. The victim support group became an anchor during difficult days. Others who'd experienced stalking understood the complex emotions: relief mixed with guilt, freedom tainted by hypervigilance, the strange grief of losing an abuser who was also family. News came that Dad had been placed in solitary confinement after attempting to manipulate other inmates into contacting me. Even in prison, he couldn't stop trying to control my life. The warden implemented special restrictions to prevent any communication attempts. I learned to recognize the lasting effects of his control. Certain phrases triggered anxiety. Unexpected kindness from strangers made me suspicious. I had to consciously override the defensive mechanisms that had once protected me but now limited my life. Ben proposed on a quiet evening at home, no grand gestures or public displays. He understood that spectacle triggered my anxiety, that privacy felt safer than performance. The proposal was perfect in its simplicity, free from the surveillance that had defined so much of my life. Wedding planning revealed more ingrained fears. Guest lists made me anxious, imagining Dad somehow infiltrating the celebration. Vendor meetings triggered suspicion that anyone could be his spy. We kept the plans simple and the guest list small, prioritizing emotional safety over social expectations. The ceremony itself was held at a private venue with security present, not because Dad posed a physical threat from prison, but because I needed the reassurance. Friends and chosen family celebrated with us, people who'd proven their loyalty through the chaos of exposure and trial. Mom walked me down the aisle, both of us reclaiming a moment Dad had stolen from us. Her presence represented survival and resilience. We'd both escaped his control, found freedom on the other side of fear. Life settled into new rhythms: work, home, relationships, all chosen rather than permitted. The ordinary felt extraordinary after years of surveillance. Every mundane decision was a small victory over the control that had once defined my existence. Therapy continued, less intensive but still necessary. Healing wasn't linear. Some days brought setbacks, moments when Dad's voice echoed in my mind, telling me I couldn't survive without his protection. But those voices grew quieter over time. I started writing about my experience, first in private journals, then in online support forums. The response overwhelmed me. So many people had similar stories of family members whose love had twisted into control. My story helped others recognize their own situations. A year after Dad's imprisonment, I received notice that he'd been diagnosed with serious health issues. The prison offered me the chance to visit, to perhaps find closure before it was too late. I declined. Some relationships couldn't be repaired, some forgiveness couldn't be granted. Ben and I bought a house in our new city, putting down roots in soil Dad had never touched. Every room we decorated, every routine we established was ours alone. The freedom to choose paint colors without surveillance felt like rebellion. We adopted a dog from the shelter, naming her Hope. She brought joy uncalled complicated by human manipulation. Her simple needs and unconditional affection helped heal parts of me that human relationships couldn't reach. I advanced in my career, earning promotions based on merit rather than navigating around Dad's interference. Success felt different when it wasn't achieved despite sabotage. I could finally focus on growth rather than survival. The support group evolved into advocacy work. We pushed for better legal protections for stalking victims, especially those targeted by family members. Dad's case became a cautionary tale in training materials for law enforcement and social workers. 2 years after his imprisonment, Dad died alone in the prison medical ward. The news came through official channels, clinical and distant. I felt nothing at first, then a complex mix of relief and sorrow. Not grief for him, but for the father he could have been if fear hadn't consumed him. There was no funeral to attend. Dad had alienated everyone who might have mourned him. His legacy was cautionary rather than celebratory. He died as he'd lived, isolated by his own need for control. I marked his passing quietly, acknowledging the end of a chapter without mourning its conclusion. The man who'd dominated my life for so long had finally lost all power over me. His death changed nothing about my daily existence. I'd already found freedom. Ben and I started a family, determined to break the cycle. Our daughter arrived on a spring morning, perfect and vulnerable. Holding her, I promised she'd know protection without suffocation, love without conditions, safety without surveillance. Parenting triggered unexpected anxieties. Every protective instinct had to be examined, ensuring it came from love rather than control. I caught myself wanting to monitor too closely, to shield too completely, and had to consciously choose trust over fear. Our daughter grew surrounded by the family we'd chosen. Mom became a grandmother who respected boundaries. Friends became aunts and uncles who modeled healthy relationships. She'd never know the isolation Dad had imposed on my childhood. Years passed. The acute trauma faded into processed memory. Dad's imprisonment and death became historical facts rather than active wounds. I could tell my story without reliving it, share my experience without drowning in it. The advocacy work expanded. We created resources for recognizing family stalking, for understanding how love could twist into control. Dad's meticulous records, seized as evidence, became educational tools for identifying escalating behaviors. My daughter reached school age, confident and social in ways I'd never been allowed to be. She brought friends home without fear. She went to sleepovers without hourly check-ins. She lived the childhood Dad had stolen from me. Sometimes she asked about her grandfather, curious about family history. I told her age-appropriate truths. He'd been sick in a way that made him hurt people he claimed to love. We'd protected her by staying away. She accepted this with the simple wisdom of children. The house filled with normal chaos. Birthday parties Dad would have investigated, sleepovers he would have monitored, friendships he would have sabotaged. Each celebration was a victory over the controlled environment he'd tried to create. I achieved professional success that had nothing to do with him. Published articles about recognizing family stalking, spoke at conferences about survival and recovery, used my experience to help others escape similar situations. The woman who'd once sat trapped in her apartment, staring at fabricated evidence, had transformed completely. Not through dramatic gestures, but through thousands of small choices. Each decision made freely. Each relationship formed without fear. Each day lived on my own terms. Freedom wasn't a destination reached through Dad's imprisonment or death. It was a daily practice of choosing trust over suspicion, connection over isolation, growth over mere survival. Some days were harder than others, but the trajectory was consistently toward healing. My story became one of many in the survivor community. We shared strategies and strength, proving that control could be overcome. Dad had tried to isolate me, but his actions had ultimately connected me to others who understood. The girl who'd texted hourly photos had become a woman who chose her own path. The employee whose coworkers feared association had become a leader who fostered genuine connection. The daughter trapped by false protection had become a mother who offered real safety. Looking at my life now, I saw not what Dad had taken, but what I'd built despite him. A marriage based on trust, a career earned through merit, a daughter raised in freedom, friendships chosen without fear. Every normal moment was a quiet victory. The scared woman in that parking garage had found her strength not through confrontation, but through patient dismantling of control. She'd discovered that freedom came not from destroying the controller, but from building a life beyond their reach. That morning when I'd noticed the billboard error had changed everything. One small crack in Dad's perfect plan had let light into years of darkness. Sometimes liberation came from grand gestures, sometimes from tiny details. Mine had come from both. Thanks for sticking with me through all the questions and wonderings. Definitely made for an interesting ride. Until we meet again, subscribe for more content like this.